The second object that I've chosen to talk about in this discussion of stone is an object that I have a similar emotional relationship with, I think, than I do with that what's known as the green head, the Berlin green head. This is a piece of Romanesque sculpture of stone carving, which is in Chichester Cathedral. Now, one of the reasons why I find this particular sculpture so compelling is because it's in a cathedral surrounded by works of modernist art from the middle of the 20th century. It's a Romanesque relief sculpture with varying different kinds of levels of depth where the chisels have gone. And the choice of how deep the chisels go, which you can see around the large scale, like full length figure of Jesus Christ just to the right of the centre, the chisels have been dug in to create shadows. I mean, there's a reason why you spend so long digging your chisel right down. It's so that you create a certain kind of tonal range within the sculpture. In other words, if you're making a sculpture like this, you're acting a little bit like a painter, but you're using light in the building as your palette, I would say. So I find that really fascinating. I also find it fascinating that we don't know who made it. That it was made at a time when artists were not thought of perhaps as being artists as we would understand them today. They certainly didn't sign their work, or they very rarely did. So it's a collectively produced piece of work, which is also fascinating. And of course, a cathedral is a collectively produced piece of work as well. What we're seeing here, I mean, I'm slightly loath with works of art like this to reduce it to its story. But the story is really one of the most mysterious stories in the Bible, which is that the moment when a man is raised from the dead, which only happens twice in the Bible, from what I recall, except for at the end of the world. And one is Lazarus, and the other is Jesus Christ himself. So this is Lazarus being raised from the dead, while figures around adopt attitudes of surprise and of piety, as you would expect. At the bottom left corner, there are two guys who are digging open the grave of Lazarus. Lazarus is actually still wrapped up in his kind of winding cloth. He's still wrapped up in his shroud. So he's come out of the grave. I think the detail of those grave diggers, is really interesting. I think it's really interesting because you could suggest that the people who made the object thought of themselves as being a bit like those men. I mean, this is pure fancy, isn't it? It's pure speculation, but that's all we have with history. That's all we have. This is the only evidence we have. We don't know anything else about it. All we know is that those two men were made. Now, at the bottom, I just see them as grudgingly going about their work, as being like workmen. And I wonder perhaps if some of the people that made this object thought of themselves as being like them, as being like labourers. Or perhaps they thought that they had a higher calling, we don't know. But nevertheless, I find the detail of labourers within a heavily laboured work really interesting. Now look, it's not the way it looked when it was made. That's assumed with works of art that are as old as this. I mean, it probably, almost certainly would have been painted. We don't know what the colours would have been like. Probably quite bright, so it was a painting. I mean, it was a sort of painted sculpture. It might have had jewels. They might have used jewels for the eyes. They might have laid jewels in some of the eyes, almost certainly the eyes of Jesus Christ. So again, it would have had a really different effect when it was originally made. What happened was, this is a sculpture that was overlooked for hundreds of years. It was rediscovered in the cathedral in the 19th century, in the 1820s, and then became really one of the treasures of the cathedral. But it really came into its own in the 20th century because, as I mentioned, or as I would say, it's the kind of aesthetic that modernist artists would look at. So it's become a sort of default modern work of art. So its narrative, I mean, there are elements that are kind of conventional. You know, the most important person is the biggest, which is Jesus Christ. You know, there's a hierarchy of size, which indicates who's more important. And there's also a certain kind of reduction of detail of incident, isn't there? I mean, you see the faces are reduced or schematized into simple expressions. That doesn't mean they're not affecting, though. It doesn't mean the fact that they're not classical, the fact they're not highly naturalistic, doesn't mean they're not affecting. What it means is that emotion comes first over the desire to be scientifically accurate, and I respect that. So you have attitudes of, it's very serious work of art. I mean, it's very solemn. You can see that there's a sense of sadness or melancholy to the faces. I mean, that's a style. Yeah, it's a style of the art of this time. But not just that, it also lends the whole narrative a kind of gravity and seriousness, because this is about somebody being raised from the dead. And if you're a Christian, you look at this and you say, that's going to be me at the end of the world. That's what's going to happen to me. We don't know if the people who made this believe that. I mean, probably some of them did, maybe some of them didn't. But the point is that it's a work of art that's full of feeling. But I think the stone element of it, which has been revealed over time because the paint's faded away, the stone element of it makes it seem that much more serious. You think of this word grave, it feels like grave and serious, and it's partly because of the fact the stone feels grave. I mean, it's like a grave stone. So I find it so rich as a work of art, incredibly rich, and the richer for the fact that we don't know who made it. I just find that intensely exciting. I could look at it forever.